All right. Welcome everyone to a new episode of the Roscoe's Wetsuit podcast. I have a very special guest today. We have Jay Shifman on the show. Jay is a speaker, writer, consultant, coach, and advocate. He's passionate about issues of addiction and mental health. He has a really interesting story that he's going to come on the show to share. So, Jay, really happy to have you on today. Glad we're able to connect.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And it's always great talking about issues of substance misuse, recovery, mental health, all that. And I'm always delighted and honored when people ask me to come on and talk about those. So thank you for taking the time, and thank you for being an advocate yourself.
Absolutely. So let's just get right into it. Where, can you kind of take our listeners through kind of a journey as far as, your personal story of kind of, like your experience with kind of falling into the depths of addiction, but then how did you kind of, get through that and end up on the other side?
Yeah, so I was incredibly lucky. I was born into a very loving family in Cincinnati, Ohio. Grew up in the Jewish suburb of Amberley of Cincinnati, and I'm the oldest of four boys, two loving parents. So I was, very loved from an early age. I never wanted for anything, is how I describe it. But when I was 11, like many in my generation, I'm 33, and my generation was essentially used as the lab rats in giant experiment aimed at trying to treat the what was called attention hyperactivity or deficit or ADD, ADHD, this whole thing, the whole spectrum of that, those what we would call those symptoms. So I was put on medication at 11, and we now know the way that impacts the brain. And look, we can all remember what it was like to go through puberty. It's not the easiest thing in the world. And when you add high rates of chemicals to that changing brain, it shouldn't surprise anybody if it goes a little haywire. We know that now. At the time, that wasn't really talked about. And so when I was showing signs of having some adverse effects to that high dose of medication, my therapist said that I was showing signs of a mood disorder, which means, of course, not long after I start being treated for that as well. And by my late teens, it has a name. I've been diagnosed as bipolar. And by the time I'm 20, I'm on 5, 6 different medications a day, all at very high dosage. And my life slowly unravels. I am abusing every single one of those prescriptions. And my therapist knows this, which is the really scary part. And that, at least, we've made progress on. When you see somebody now, there are databases that flag this. I was filling my prescriptions in 12, 14 days in what's supposed to be a month, and my therapist was approving all of this. So now that would be flagged. It wasn't at the time. This is 2000 and 2000 to 2009 is roughly the period that we're talking about here. So by the age of 23, I'd lost everything. I'd been working since I was 14, and jobs are gone. I'd been in school and I failed out. I was in a fraternity, and all of that is gone. And I'm spending most days on my couch, really unable to do much more. Every morning I wake up and I'm immediately going into withdrawals. So I have to take a pill the minute I wake up, or I spend the next hour or so wrapped around my toilet on my bathroom floor. And that was a summer that I gave up. I just crashed. I dumped out what I thought would be a lethal dosage of my prescriptions, and I called a friend and told her what I had done. Luckily for me, while I did go through an overdose that night, I spent the night handcuffed to a gurney at the local hospital, and not the morgue. They took me to the hospital. I was monitored the whole time, and they kept me from dying. And I came to the next day in a lockdown unit in another suburb of Cincinnati, where I would spend 3 weeks in the what you see in the movies isn't far off. I mean, that's where I was for 3 weeks. And after that, I was checked out and sent to a long-term care facility in the woods of Stockbridge, Massachusetts. in the Berkshires. And I was incredibly lucky there that I got to know people with both issues of mental health as well as issues with substance misuse. And that's when I started to realize that my story, my experience was more like those struggling with drugs than it was with people who were even going through bipolar disorder, which is what I was told that I had. So I started to question my diagnosis. And one of the final straws came when I asked my therapist there if we could try getting off everything. Like, look, this clearly, whether we decide this is a true diagnosis or not, very clearly the drugs are not helping me, right? I'm here and these drugs are helping other people, are not helping me. And he was down for it if the goal was to get me off those drugs and then start with something new. And I didn't want to agree to that. I didn't want to go into this experiment with the only outcome being immediately starting on something else. And so I checked myself out. I was there against my will, but I wasn't there. I wasn't court ordered, so I could check myself out, and I did. And I went to live with my grandparents outside of Sedona, Arizona, where over about 3 months, I withdrew from all the drugs. I was on so many that if I had just stopped altogether, my body, I would have died like right away. I would have gone into a massive withdrawal and died. So I slowly over 3+ months, I withdrew and then spent the next 5 years finally going through the development that I should have gone through years before. It honestly took me a good 5 years for my body, for my brain to catch up with sort of my actual age. And then at the same time, I was rebuilding my life. I was sort of trying to rebuild the friendships that I had lost. I went back to school. I got jobs and kind of relearned how to be an adult. And that took me to 5 years ago, where I first told my story on stage. And since then, I've been speaking about it and trying to end this stigma and help anyone that I can along the way.
That's amazing.
Thank you.
So what was that process? What was that 5-year process like, as far as, what sort of, development did you feel like you had to, go through to kind of get to the other side?
Well, that's a great question. So everything as basic as just being able to sort of trust my thought process, if that makes sense. I had never had an emotion that I didn't mitigate, or I didn't, I guess address would be the better word, with drugs before. When you're on that high levels of medication, if you've ever seen the show House, I like to use this analogy because everybody kind of gets it. The way he popped his Vicodin was what I was doing with Klonopin, which I was being treated for anxiety. That was my pill for that. And so if I would have any sort of a mood, I would just immediately take a Klonopin. So I didn't really know how to have actual emotions. I didn't know how to deal with the thoughts in my head because for so long I'd done so by treating myself with my medication. And not only that, I was on such high medication that if I wanted to sort of experience anything at all, the same way that one of my friends at the time may have, you know, taken some kind of other drug. For me, that was cocaine because it was the only thing powerful enough to cut through what was already in my body. So I had to learn how to have a good time in my own head and not immediately want to leave this world. So that was a big part of it. And then also learning life skills. When I was struggling with my substance misuse, I didn't know how to keep a budget. I didn't know how to pay my rent. I didn't know how to pay my bills because the only thing I cared about was making sure that I had enough drugs to keep me from going through withdrawal. So it was the entire spectrum of what it means to be a person, what it means to be an adult, that I had to relearn and teach myself.
And was it mainly a process, like an internal process of you sort of just having to sit with these different emotions and sort of process this stuff, or were there people who sort of coached you or kind of, guided you through it?
Well, that's a great question, and I wish I could give you a black and white answer, but the answer is both. There was a lot of self discovery. I definitely do feel a little sense of sadness for the young woman I was dating at the time, and for people around me, because I'm sure that it was difficult seeing this happen to me. It would be like if you were, I was 25 by this point. It would be like if you were 25, but your best friend or your boyfriend was a teenager. You know what I mean? Like it would be tough to see them going through some of the things they were going through. But also, I had enrolled in school with a major of psychology, and I did that on purpose because I wanted to learn more about what had happened to me and about what was happening to me. So that was incredibly influential. And then also my family was very supportive at this point. We had sort of, I wouldn't say lost touch, but we had grown estranged during my worst period, besides my grandparents who I was living with. And they were very supportive by this point. I was living at home for a little bit before moving back out with some friends. And, I couldn't have done it without them for sure.
Right. Absolutely. So, one thing I may have mentioned to you, I'm not sure, as far as, I work at, an addiction medicine center, and, we see, both a lot of, substance abuse along with mental health, and there's sort of a divide, between the different programs, but it almost always seems like you can't, they go together. I mean,
That's
it's
right.
like, do you have a personal opinion as far as like, does one does kind of doing a lot of drugs create the mental health problems usually, or do the mental health problems cause people to create a lot of or use a lot of drugs, or is it, do you have any opinion on that?
Well, it really is a chicken or the egg situation,
Yeah.
right? For a lot of people. And I do think it matters for the person. As my story, clearly shows, I was already struggling with, look, I definitely have ADHD, or at least symptoms of that disorder. I've struggled with depression and anxiety my whole life. I have OCD that is low level, that was inflamed during this period. But all of those were manageable until the drugs were added to the mix. So it's kind of hard, at least for my story, to break it down, because at what level do those things become, an issue, right? A quote unquote issue. Now, look, I was a rambunctious kid. I don't take anything away from that. Did the drugs help? It's really hard to tell. So for me, it is really hard to split the two. I've been super lucky to work with people both who have substance misuse issues and people who don't, but are working on their mental health. And I think it's kind of what it comes down to is, where is that line drawn, where it's like, okay, are you struggling with anxiety? Well, right now, if you don't have some kind of anxiety with what we're going through, I have more questions about that than I do with you having the anxiety. So I think it's important to sort of draw the line. At which point are we calling this, an issue of mental health? But that's all a long answer to your short answer, which is that I think it's really incredible that we're now starting to draw the parallels a lot more than we used to. So I think it's awesome that you work there and you are asking these questions, because that question would not have been asked when I was, in the facility back in 2009. That question was not asked at all. I was a person struggling with mental health, and as I told you in my story, the drugs were essentially off limits. It was, we do not question the drugs; those are only helping. So I applaud you and the people you work with if you are asking those questions. That is a huge step in the right direction.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks. So, switching gears a little bit, I saw in your bio you're certified in psychological first aid. Can you tell me a little about kind of how you got into that, what that is, and just sort of explain that for our listeners?
Yeah. So first off, I want to say that I think it's something everyone should do. It's essentially it's CPR for the mind, right? And I think, by the way, everyone should be certified in both. I was certified in CPR. I got to get that redone as hopefully as soon as COVID's over and I feel comfortable going to a personal class again. But I carry Narcan with me wherever I go, because look, we are still living in this opioid epidemic where people, unfortunately, where I was living in Cincinnati, the numbers were skyrocketing, and I felt that it was incredibly important to. But if you don't do it correctly, you're probably not going to hurt someone. I mean, Narcan can, in the rare certain circumstances, make it worse for someone. It's unlikely, but you may not help them the way that you can if you know CPR. The same is exactly true for psychological first aid. So essentially what it is it just teaches you how to tap into this natural part of ourselves, the empathetic part that is of service during these stressful times. And some of your listeners may say, oh, well, that's simple. I hope that's true. I hope for you it just comes naturally. And some people are better just naturally equipped with that ability than other people. But it is an excellent course that reminds us of some of these skills. And if we have never used them before, it's sort of like building up a muscle. So if you are in a situation where essentially, like I said, CPR for the mind is needed, you are going to make sure that you're helping and not hurting, because as this training, will teach you, it is definitely possible to make things worse if you try to provide aid in these moments and you're not prepared to do so, not only for the person that you're trying to help, but for yourself, if you are not prepared to be that person. So psychological first aid is just a skill based class that teaches you some things and also reminds you of some of these things that do come naturally to us, but aren't necessarily trained if they're not used often.
Right, right. And what would you say, like, what are the biggest like concepts or like takeaways that you sort of got, that might not be super intuitive, or just things that have helped you be able to, provide that psychological first aid if needed?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say there's two big ones that I took away, and obviously this is very personal for everyone who's done this. But for me, number one was how important words are, because if you are in an extreme state, let's say, God forbid, you're in an area where a tornado just came through, and someone says the wrong thing, you're already on edge, and oh man, and it's not their fault if you set somebody off because you don't know how to talk to somebody who's just lost everything. So watching the words you use is incredibly important. That's number one. Number two was how important it is to listen and take cues from what the person is saying. Again, if you rush in and you say, I know what to do here, and you try to tell somebody something who's just lost everything, or God forbid, it's just seen someone die in front of them, you're going to do more harm. That is just flat out true. So making sure you're listening to the person and hearing where they are, and then accommodating that in what you are saying to them and what you're recommending, because man, it is just so easy. Think back to even, if you've been in a situation where you have just been hit by something horrible has happened. If someone comes in trying to help, but they say the wrong thing, it's almost worse than if they had just said nothing. In fact, most of the time it is.
Right, right. Yeah. So are these skills, or is this a practice you feel like can you apply this to, say, like, with the homeless population, obviously the rampant kind of mental health, issues that they have, um, you know, and obviously, people see, people they just deem crazy, just doing, but they can't really do anything to help, or they just choose to kind of be bystanders. Do you feel like you got any skills by any chance that might help kind of deal with one of those situations?
Well, I definitely would say first, to your specific scenario, if someone feels like they don't know how to do something, I've been there. I feel that way right now, watching what is happening on the streets of our country. My wife and I have been to a protest. I've given money, I've used my voice, but it still doesn't feel enough. In that case, it's better to not push. It's better to not risk doing something that could make it worse, right? So make sure you're following somebody else's lead if you don't know how to help. If you've been through this training that I have, and by the way, quick shout out, I did it through John Hopkins. I believe it was their I don't want to say this wrong, but I believe it was their health university. I did it online, which was awesome because I did it right before COVID. And so it's been helpful as I've been coaching people through this process. That's what I do. A lot of is personal coaching, and this class 100% helped with that because so many people are feeling emotions that they just don't know how to deal with right now. And that is so normal. I mean, we're all feeling that way, right? None of us, most of us, that 0.001% that has lived through a pandemic before, but most of us have just no idea how to process these emotions we're feeling. So this definitely has helped me a lot with that. But in terms of that specific scenario, yes, I think it is incredibly important to be able to sit with the person and listen to them because, you know, any situation where we're treating people with an umbrella, we're going to end up hurting in some way. So we have to tailor a lot of these responses to an individual person. You and I see it all the time in the substance misuse world where we try to, just if we go into a situation thinking, okay, well, you've struggled with alcohol, so here's what we're going to do. You may leave that person behind if that plan doesn't actually fit what they're struggling with. So making sure that we're tailoring our response to an individual and not our presumptions about their situation. I mean, that's incredibly important anyways, but yes, this course did help with that.
Right. And I mean, that seems like an approach, at least that I endorse, just with like psychology and psychiatry overall, treating, the individual compared to just, labeling someone as, you have this disorder, you have that disorder, and then, giving whatever kind of standard course of treatment, not to say that can't be helpful for some people, but I think like grouping, just grouping people and then doing a one size fits all thing like doesn't
Definitely.
seem to work well.
No, and being someone in recovery, I struggle with prescription pills, but there may be a lot of overlap with someone who struggled with heroin. And just because I struggle with pills and you struggle with pills, it doesn't mean our treatment is going to be exactly the same. In fact, it's definitely possible that it's going to be very different.
Interesting. Right. Absolutely. So switching gears a little bit, tell me, you have a podcast as well. So tell me kind of how you got started with that. What was your interest in doing that, and tell me a little about it.
Yeah, so before COVID, I was doing a lot of public speaking. That's sort of my bread and butter. I truly believe those of us in the recovery community need to be telling our story all the time. It's how we break down stigma. It's how we educate. And I was doing a lot of that, and I love doing it. As you can tell, I love talking about these topics, and it's good because I'm not getting rich off it, so it's okay that I do this every day because I love doing it. But when COVID was starting to look like it was going to be as bad as we, obviously ended up finding out that it was, I was worried. I was like, I don't know how I'm going to, keep getting my message out there. I went, like no joke, the day after the NBA season was canceled, when we kind of look back and go, okay, that's the day everybody knew this was going to be horrible. I lost 3 speaking engagements that first day, and I was like, oh God, this is going to be bad. Luckily for me, 3 weeks or a month before that, a buddy of mine had just started his own podcast. He's a comedian in Chicago, one of my best friends, and I love him dearly. He's basically a brother to me. And I said to him, "Look, man, I love you, but if you can do this, I can do this." So, so I looked at that and went, "All right, I'm going to start doing this." And that was in February. So when things got as bad as it was in March, I was already on the way, and I'm really glad that I did that because it's been my ability to keep getting the message out there and keep talking to people during this crisis. So I've been very lucky that I signed up for some websites, some podcastguest.com. I'll give a shout out to that one because that one's great. And I used that early on to get a couple of guests. And, it's just, as well, the topics of mental health and substance misuse are a thing that people want to talk about, but they're scared. Stigma is very real. And what better way than a podcast? They can put their headphones in and no one has to know that they're listening to this. So it took off, and I've been really lucky in that respect. People have been excited to come on the podcast. What's been great is that I started with just people who work in the mental health or substance misuse world. And that's kind of spiraled a little bit to, in a positive way, to talking to people who, touch it a little bit. So I've talked with some musicians about what it's like to maintain your mental health. on the road or touring. One guy, he just crossed 1 million streams on Spotify, and we had a really honest conversation about how you stay grounded. That's a big number. Like I don't know how I would deal with if 1 million people were listening to my music. That would inflate my head, just flat out. So we talked about what that's like to stay grounded. And I'm talking to some entrepreneurs about how to maintain a sense of self in the entrepreneurial world. So it revolves around topics of mental health and substance misuse. And a lot of the people are in the substance misuse and mental health world, but there's also people who we stay on that topic, but in different atmospheres as well.
Sure. A question that just came to mind as you were, saying some of that stuff. When when you look back and you originally made that decision to start sharing your story, before the podcast, just I'm
Mm-hmm.
talking just your general story of, addiction and recovery. Was it something that was tough? Did you want to sort of, you know, keep it internal, not let people know about it? And then what was sort of like the process of sort of going public with that?
Yeah, so thanks for asking that, because this is like my favorite story to tell. In 2015, I've got a buddy. He's still a good friend. And in fact, he's been on the podcast. He introduces me every podcast. It's a recording of him. But he runs an organization in Cincinnati, where I'm from, and where I was living at the time, that gives influential or well-known Cincinnatians the platform to tell their origin story. Because his whole goal, he and his partner, were to create communities through storytelling. And he knew my story a little bit. Like I said, we're good friends, and he asked me to do this, and I was like, hell no, that's not going to happen. Nobody knows this about me. Even some of my closest friends don't know this about me. And he asked me again, and I said nope. And he asked me again, and I said nope. And I went home to dinner one night. I went to go see my parents, and I walked into my dad's study, and he's sitting there reading the paper, and I was like, so, just this thing just happened, and I think it's kind of funny. And he said, why wouldn't you do that? And I said, well, I'm terrified. Who knows what people are going to think about me if they know that. I saw it as a scarlet letter that I was in recovery. And I still remember this moment perfectly. He lowered the newspaper. He looked right at me and he said, fear is never a good reason not to do something. And he picked back up the paper as if he didn't know he just blew up my entire world. So the next day, I went to my buddy and I was like, all right, ask me again. And he did. And I said yes. And it was about 150 people in that room, and I opened with the joke, I've never told this to this many people who didn't have to be there before. I'm in recovery. I'm a recovering addict. And the response was incredible. I had good friends who, like I said, had no idea, that came up to me and were actually angry with me that I hadn't told them. And one of my brothers was there, and he like broke down crying. I mean, it was a beautiful moment, and it launched everything. I mean, everything that I do now is because of that night. So the message I always like to impart when I tell that story is, all of the fears are in your head. Every single one of them. I was terrified of what people were going to say, and none of it came true. In fact, it was all the opposite. And I cannot stress that enough. All of the fears are in your head. None of the bad stuff's going to happen.
Right, right. I mean, it sounds like you sort of got over that by just facing it head on.
Yeah.
If you had kept refusing to do that, those invitations, you probably still would be, afraid to do it, right?
Yep, and the Choose Your Struggle podcast wouldn't be a thing, and I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you, all of it because of one night. And I cannot thank my dad enough for those wise words of wisdom, and I can't thank my friend enough for continuing to push and asking me to be on his show.
Absolutely. So I'm kind of curious, as we've sort of, alluded to with the COVID-19 stuff going on right now, what do you see as sort of I mean, it could be both the psychological and the substance abuse, impacts of this, because, we've already seen, alcohol sales, go through the roof, right? I'm sure, if there were able to be similar statistics about, drug use, I'm sure that, the rates of that would be escalating similarly. So what do what do you feel like is going to happen, in the coming years, or just what's going to be the impact of all this?
Well, I mean that's a great question, and I think that anyone who says, "Well, this is what's going to happen," usually is wrong. So I'm scared just to be on the record. That being said, there are a couple truths that we're already seeing from just those couple of months, and the first one I think is so incredibly important. Is we all know the saying, if you work in the mental health world, 1 in 5, and that's the estimate that at any given moment, 1 in 5 people is struggling with an issue of mental health. And that can be anything as kind of every day as anxiety, or all the way up to, some of these extreme issues of mental health. There was an estimate not long ago, and I don't want to be wrong about who it was, and I should have looked this up, but I didn't. But the estimate by someone, a leading organization in the field, was that during COVID, that number blossomed to 1 in 2. So right off the bat, we are going to see more people waking up to, oh, this is what it's like to live with anxiety, or wow, I never realized that I need to do more for my mental health. So I truly believe that it is going to leapfrog us vastly forward in the field of empathizing for issues of mental health, because more people are going to know what it's like to live with these issues. And not only that, more people are going to be farther along on the spectrum of feeling like they need to do something about it. There's this saying, before stage 4, right, where we only address issues of mental health when we're at stage 4. I think that this is going to help that, because so many people are going to go, I never want to feel that way again. If that means starting to work on my mental health now so I don't, fantastic. So I think that's number one. Unfortunately, conversely, with issues of substance misuse, we are seeing an explosion. You said it correctly, and now with alcohol sales, there was a lot of people stocking up because there were these unfounded rumors they were going to close alcohol stores. But you're also not wrong. I mean, we are seeing way more use of alcohol and substances. And again, that goes with my first point. If you're dealing with an emotion that you're not prepared for, that you don't know how to handle, you're going to turn to crutches. I mean, that is just basic mental health math, right? And what is the easiest crutch? A substance, of misusing a substance. So I do think we're going to see rises in rates of people who are going to need treatment for substance misuse. I hope I'm wrong. I hope all those estimates are wrong. That would be wonderful. I don't think they are. In Cincinnati, they just put out I still keep up with all my friends in Cincinnati, and they just let me know that there's a call because the last couple of days they've seen an extreme spike in overdoses. That's unfortunately not that surprising. More people are using more. They're trying to deal with these emotions. So I think those are the big two. One's a positive, and one is unfortunately an extreme negative.
Right. The other thing I was just thinking of, with all the, people doing telehealth visits now, right? Kind of the explosion of that. Since there is still the stigma, surrounding mental health and, substance abuse, if people are, more inclined now to do these telehealth visits from their own home and be able to, speak to practitioners without, going out to the office or whatever in fear of, whatever being seen or noticed, that could be, a potential positive of it too. I was just,
No,
that just came to my mind.
you're definitely right. It is, and we're seeing that already. They've already shown that the numbers of people using it are slowly creeping up. But not only
Interesting.
that, it allows you to easier shop for a therapist. There's this misconception. I'm sure you hear this all the time, that people kind of try a therapist once and they're going, oh, that didn't work. It must have been therapy just doesn't work for me. Well, no, it takes a while to find a therapist you have a good relationship with sometimes. So, I do think the telehealth helps in that sense, because it allows someone to try it and go, maybe that wasn't the best fit. I'll try this other one. And you never have to leave your home. You can be right there at your computer and get a sense of who they are as a person. So that's also a positive for sure.
Right. Right. So I wanted to ask you, we touched on, we just touched on therapy a little bit, but as far as other sort of modalities that you think are helpful that currently are out there, or maybe that we'll see going forward in the future, as far as being able to help people kind of deal with, as you were talking about, kind of deal with all of this range of emotions without turning to a substance as a crutch. What sort of stuff in that regard is interesting to you?
Yeah. So I would say number one, as I said, mental health coaching is still very new. I didn't know it was a thing until about 2 years ago. And mental health coaching, for those who are listening, have never heard of this. Think of the mental health coach as the personal trainer to your therapist being the doctor, right? You wouldn't go to your doctor and say, "Hey, doc, what am I going to lift in the gym today?" The doctor would look at you like you're nuts, right? But you also wouldn't go to your personal trainer and say, "I'm having a weird pain in my side." He hopefully would say, "Well, go to your doctor. What are you doing talking to me?" So that's sort of the relationship, and that's where I come in. I'm not a therapist. I never want to replace your therapist. I personally think that every person should see a therapist. But if you're spending, most people, if they're seeing a therapist, are going once a month, once every 2 weeks. If you're spending your entire time talking about things like mindfulness or practicing, daily affirmations, these are all really important things. To be frank, it's a little below the pay grade of your therapist. You should be using your time with your therapist for these higher level things that are really, that's what they're trained for. That's what these amazing people are best at. So that's where someone like me comes in. If you're struggling with suicidality, my first thought is going to be, you need to probably call 911, or call your therapist. It's not where I come in. But if you want to talk about mindfulness, if you want to talk about things you can do every single day, if you want to talk about sort of the surface level stuff that, you just need someone to talk to, that's where I come in. So number one is the mental health coach is a newer thing that's growing. I love it because it allows me to help people, and also it allows me to sort of preach the gospel of going to therapy, because I think we should all be doing that. I told a friend not long ago that since I moved here into Charleston from Cincinnati 9 months ago, I've seen 5 different therapists, and he went, "Dude, are you nuts?" I was like, "No." I was like, the first one was good at one thing, and the second one I didn't really like that much, so I would try the third one. And he and I were working on this different thing, and then my wife and I tried a couple different marriage therapists. So it's okay to use therapists for different things. But if I was going to my therapist and saying, "So how should I practice mindfulness?" that's a little below his pay grade. So definitely that's number one. But then number two is we also need to be practicing mindfulness more. And that's not just meditation. Meditation is great. If you like meditation, if you can meditate to a beneficial state, props to you. Personally, I never enjoyed it that much. I can do it. I just don't get the benefits of it that I have found for other mindfulness practices. So I think we need to be talking about that more. We need to be teaching mindfulness beyond just meditation. We need to be encouraging people to practice mindfulness in ways that are beneficial to them, and that can help with that before stage 4 idea.
Hmm. I mean, I love the sort of idea. I mean, the way I sort of think of, what you've sort of been saying, as far as like, basically helping people kind of learn how to actually operate their brains, how to operate their minds. And it's something I always use the analogy, with the patients I work with, as far as like, you know, you don't just go to the gym, when you have a shoulder injury. You
Right.
probably would actually go to your physical therapist, but it's like people only go to like get help for their brains when they have some kind of psychological issue going on. Whereas like
That's right.
it seems like with tools like mindfulness, meditation, yoga, just to name a few, I mean, these are things that can sort of enhance or sort of build resilience
100%.
in people.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and if you work with a good mental health coach, and I in no way want to toot my own horn. I've worked with people, and after a couple sessions, we've gone, you know what? I don't think I'm the best fit for you. Let me try to help you find someone else that is okay. But if you work with someone who's good and someone who gets you, I come into every new coaching engagement with literally pages of different practices, because what works for me is not going to work for you, or it may not. We don't know. We have to work through this together. So if someone comes in and day one is like, I want you to meditate, I want that does anyone listening to go, well, what if I don't want to meditate? You know what I mean? I want you to be able to have that conversation with your mental health coach, exactly as you put it, the same way you would with your physical trainer. If they came in and said, I want you to run 5 miles today, you'd be like, I don't know if I can do that. You know what I mean? Like, you need to have that conversation with them. And if they're trying to force something that you don't think you can do, you should feel empowered to say, hey, let's slow down a little bit because I don't think I'm ready for that.
Right. 100%. Yeah. And how long have you been doing the coaching for?
Yeah, so here's the funny thing is I started a couple years ago, and I was
Okay.
doing it for free because I didn't know mental health coaching was a thing, to be quite honest. And I had friends who would just, like I said, once I started speaking about this, people just started flocking. And I mean that in the best possible way, that people were just going, look, I know you'll understand. I know you've been through something. Let's just, would you mind if we talk? Always open. And that's anyone listening too. If you just need someone to talk to, find me, let's chat. But in the fall of this year, I was working with a friend, and she went, you're really good at this. And I said, thank you. That's very kind. She said, no. Like, why don't you do this professionally? And I had just not long ago learned that mental health coaching was a thing. And, a little bit of that was me not wanting to believe my own bullshit, right? I mean, I was like, oh, who am I to do any of this? And thankfully, that friend was like, get over it. You're good at this. You can help a lot of people. So I've been doing it officially since the fall. So about 7, 8, 9 months now. And, been doing it unofficially for about 2 years.
Sure. So my question I have for you is, what if, as a coach, what have you, since you look back, say, the first person that you worked with until now, what are the biggest sort of things that you feel like that you've learned in order to become, a really good coach and be able to help people, more so?
Well, that's a great question. And I do want to say, if you're hearing this and going, man, this guy must have 50,000 clients. No. This is still growing. This is still a thing that I'm, between you and me, I'm still struggling with how to charge all the time. Some people come to me right off the bat and say, I want to be an official client. Other people, they're friends. And so I don't really feel comfortable. It's a growing thing. It's a gray area. For those who have actually been clients, I'll tell you one story. A woman approached me. She heard me on someone else's podcast and reached out and said, she told me the situation with her son, who had relapsed twice after going through AA. And she said to me, it's like he doesn't care what I want anymore. And I had to help her understand. And this was the greatest challenge I've faced as a coach so far, was how to help her understand in a loving, sympathetic way, that he doesn't care. I mean, in that moment, what he wants is what's best for him. You know what I mean? Like, if you're struggling with a substance misuse issue and your mom is there yelling at you, you don't. It's like, you don't care what the mom. I mean, you still love that person, and then down in your core, you want that relationship that's missing. But you're not waking up and going, I got to do this for my mom. I mean, that's just not realistic. But it's hard to help someone understand that if they've never been there. And that one was tough. I succeeded I asked her, specifically, I said, before I talk to you anymore, I would like to talk to your son. And we did. We had a great chat, and he's doing a lot better. But it was a challenge, because it was really hard for me to see this from a different perspective than the one I had lived, which is the son's perspective. Seeing this from hers and relating to her in that way was very difficult. And I definitely don't think I did it perfectly.
Sure. Well, I guess just a learning experience.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, Jay, we're coming up onto the end of the show. I've really enjoyed, this discussion we've had today. Um, I want, let people know, let the listeners know, where they can find you, check out your work, or get in touch with you. Feel free to just share whatever you'd like with the listeners.
Yeah. So the number one most important thing, and I know that you would echo this as well, is don't suffer in silence. It is so important to reach out. I can't tell you how many times I have personally reached out because I'm in private Facebook groups and stuff like that. My goal of being there is to reach out to people who are posting things like "I don't want to live anymore" and all that kind of stuff. Don't let it get to that point. I'm here. I don't want to speak for you, but I'm sure you would say the same thing. You're here if somebody just needs to reach out. So there are people that want to be there. There are people that love you and that want to support you. So please reach out. If you need someone to talk to, if you're interested in mental health coaching, you can find me at my website, www.jayshifman.com, JAYSHIFMAN.com. Once this reopens, I've started talking to some people about public speaking again. Probably the end of the year. We're not quite there in a safe way yet, but if that's something that you'd be interested in bringing me in, I'd love to chat. And the podcast is called Choose Your Struggle. That's my brand. It's all about when I was at my worst, I didn't really get to choose what I was struggling for. It was just getting off the couch, just avoiding withdrawals. And so now I choose what I'm struggling for every day. And it's making sure people understand and people talk about issues of mental health and substance misuse. So check out the Choose Your Struggle podcast. And I'll say this because I say it every time I talk about the podcast. The people you hear are mostly people that have reached out to me and said, I want to chat. I think I have a good story. Almost every time my answer is, yep, you do. Let's get you on the podcast. So, if you think that you would be a good person, don't be scared to reach out. I'm literally sitting here asking you to do so. So you can find me again at my website, jshifman.com, and find the Choose Your Struggle podcast wherever you get your podcasts.
Awesome. Well, Jay, again, thank you so much for coming on the show today and sharing, your story, an incredible story of, going through kind of the depths of hell and making it out. So I applaud you for that.
Well, I really appreciate you taking the time and the honor. Look, I could talk about this stuff for hours, as I'm sure you can tell. And, talking to other people who are advocates like you and are on the front lines, I cannot say this enough, but thank you. Thank you for all you're doing. Thank you for giving me the platform and other people the platform to talk about this and for being that positive change, man. We need more people like you.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Yeah. And for our listeners, who enjoyed the show today, go ahead and check us out on YouTube, like and subscribe. Where Roscoe's Wetsuit is the YouTube channel. And then you can also find audio versions of the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. So go ahead, check us out whichever way you want. Jay, again, it was a pleasure.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.